All right, let's go ahead and kick it off here. So first of all, thank you all for taking the time to join this webinar this afternoon. We'll get started in just a second, but first of all, a couple of housekeeping logistical items. First of all, my name's Kyle McNulty. I'm a manager here at Focal Point. I currently lead our DevSecOps and cloud security practices. I've experience across the security world, security operations, DevSecOps, cloud security, general application security. So it's fun to really dive into the details and the weeds of DevSecOps here and get into it. So as far as what we're actually going to be doing within the Zoom dashboard, you should see a couple of different features in front of you. First of all, there's the Q&A option, which is how we're going to be taking questions this afternoon. As you go ahead and submit your questions, I'll go ahead and look through those at the end of the presentation. You can go ahead and submit your questions whenever as we go through, and I'll take them one by one when we get to the end. As far as some other logistical pieces, the presentation should run about 45 minutes. We'll leave some time for questions at the end. And if you have additional questions that I don't have the chance to get to this afternoon, you're welcome to either email me directly, or you can go ahead and again, drop them in the chat. And if I don't get to them, I'll go ahead and reach out after with follow-up answers. One of the other key benefits of this webinar is you will be getting CPEs for your time today. Those CPEs will be issued within 48 hours. In order to get those CPEs, you do need to stay for the duration of the session, and you also need to go ahead and answer all 3 of the different polling questions that come up. The polling questions are pretty straightforward. As soon as they pop up on your screen, you'll have the option to select an answer or many answers depending on the question. And if the polling feature isn't working for you for some reason, that's no problem. Just go ahead and drop your answer into the Q&A box, and we'll go ahead and make sure that that's taken care of from a technical standpoint and that you get those CPEs that you deserve. Finally, we have a recording of the presentation that will be shared afterwards. So if you have other friends that didn't get the chance to check this out, or if you just love it so much that you have to share it with all your close coworkers, then that will be an option. Again, that should be shared within 48 hours or so from when this is finished. Now, some of these folks may not be familiar with Focal Point, so I'll just read a brief blurb here as far as Focal Point services, just as a quick introduction. Focal Point is a leading cybersecurity services provider working with the Fortune 500 and government agencies. We really work with companies of all sizes, but it ranges from very small to very large. We integrate market-leading consulting, technology integration, and cyber workforce development services to provide end-to-end solutions for security leaders. So, important thing to keep in mind there, we do provide services across all these different domains, and we also have this whole workforce development arm and training. So if that's something your organization is looking for, that's something we can do. You can learn more about our services, solutions, and team at focal-point.com, and there'll be links to that later in this presentation as well. So thank you all again for attending, and let's go ahead and dive into the presentation here. So let me share my screen. And we're all set. So first of all, as we dive in here, I want to just reiterate one more time, this webinar is designed to be tactical and strategic in the sense that as soon as you're done listening to this webinar, you should be able to go ahead and have a clear sense of what you might be able to do for your program in a very hands-on manner. I know sometimes webinars can be very abstract. You might not feel like you get any concrete value out of them. This is designed to be the antithesis of that traditional webinar. So again, even if as you think about Q&A later on, feel free to ask hands-on tactical questions. If it's something that is maybe specific to your organization, then that's something you're welcome to reach out with after the fact as well, and we can go ahead and address that. So like I said, I work in our cyber defense practice, cloud security and DevSecOps. We don't need to delve into this too much more. As far as housekeeping items, I think we've covered all this. The CPE reminder one more time, those will be provided within 48 hours of the completion of this webinar. All right, so let's take a look at a couple key statistics to go ahead and frame our conversation here. First of all, DevSecOps will be embedded in 60% of rapid development teams by 2021, as opposed to 20% in 2019. So if we think about that growth rate, rather incredible, 300% growth rate over 2 years. Key thing to keep in mind, right, is this does not mean that 60% of development teams will be using DevSecOps, but rather 60% of rapid development teams. So it's really speaking to the importance of integrating security in these different DevOps teams that have realized the kind of glaring weaknesses that come when those teams aren't following the appropriate security practices. Second, by 2023, more than 70% of DevSecOps initiatives will have incorporated automated security vulnerability and configuration scanning for open source components. So as we think about this, that's software bill of materials, software composition analysis, making sure that the libraries you're using in your applications are secure. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later as well, diving into what SCA is in a bit more detail and why it is so beneficial, just due to the low level of effort and quick wins that can be garnered for the development teams. Now, finally, 65% of security professionals reported their organizations are shifting left or bringing security into the development process earlier. 65% is a good start. I'm sure this number will continue growing as this entire trend keeps growing. Ultimately, organizations are recognizing the value of moving security left, and it will continue to trend in that direction, is my guess. So with that, let's talk about briefly who's actually using DevSecOps and why might that be in some of these examples here. So first of all, Amazon. Obviously, Amazon is doing just about everything under the sun these days, but specifically we can think about AWS and the cloud services that they're providing. As I'm sure many here are familiar with, things like AWS are rapidly changing to the point where it feels like every month there's a new feature that they're releasing on the platform. Well, beyond that, it's of utmost importance that AWS is secure because that's such a key portion of the value that they're providing. If AWS is insecure, then they lose a significant portion of their market share. And so a combination of speed and security is critically important for them. Etsy online retailer, longtime leader in this space. They had several executives that were really at the beginning of the DevOps trend almost a decade ago now, continuing to leverage those principles and taking a leadership stance in DevSecOps as well, in addition to just DevOps. And then finally, Hertz, maybe a little bit of a dark horse candidate on here. A rental car company, traditionally, you might think of it as having an outdated business structure, business model. They recognize the value of switching to cloud deployments and were able to take a DevOps approach that they've since integrated security into as well. So three different kind of companies with very different cultures that DevSecOps has worked with. And that segues nicely into our next slide here as far as who should actually be using DevSecOps. So again, as we think about DevSecOps, it's very easy to think that, oh, Netflix and Google and Facebook, of course they can do DevSecOps. They're unicorn technology companies. They have the appropriate culture, and so it's easy for them to go ahead and do it. Well, as we just saw on the last slide, it's not necessarily the case. You don't have to be a unicorn tech company. And it's important to apply these same principles to other industries that are a bit further behind in the transition and arguably need DevSecOps ideas even more. So the first example would be healthcare. So you think about the growing scope of just threat to the healthcare industry, the growing digitization of healthcare and all the new applications that are being spun up for healthcare providers, medical devices. It's just become more important than ever to address security concerns in healthcare. And DevSecOps can help empower these healthcare providers to develop their applications at speed while also developing them with the appropriate security controls in mind that allow them to comply with regulations such as HIPAA. Next, we have financial services. One of the interesting things about financial services, it's traditionally extremely regulated, but as we've seen, there's still the opportunity to move fast in financial services while dealing with regulation and acceptable risk. And that's a theme across DevSecOps that we'll talk about a bit more as we get further in, just the idea of acceptable risk and how security team members can reframe the conversation of security, and rather than saying you need to have every single security vulnerability resolved, it's, well, how can we resolve the most risk possible while also ensuring that our business can continue to provide the value that it needs to, and our developers can continue to develop at speed. And then finally, everyone's favorite, government. Everyone's been to the DMV before. It's characteristically slow. So there's an opportunity there to really speed up its deployment cycles, its development cycles, and ensure that security is incorporated within that process as well. As we think about attacks like SolarWinds, I mean, there's more attention than ever on government resources, and securing government resources has never been a higher priority. So the point here, as we think about these last couple slides, is DevSecOps is all over the place, but there's some areas that are falling behind. Whatever industry you're in, there's probably an opportunity for DevSecOps. And so if you have more questions about specific challenges with industries as we go through, again, feel free to drop it in Q&A. So with that, we get to poll question number 1. And how mature is your DevSecOps program? We're just trying to get an understanding of the crowd here, how far you are along this journey using the classic 5-point scale, with initial being the least mature and optimizing being the most mature. Don't worry, you don't need a perfect answer. I know we don't have the full definitions outlined here, but just give it your best kind of guess. And we'll just give it another, let's say, 30 seconds here, and then go ahead and move on. Again, you do have to complete all 3 polls in order to get that CPE credit. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll. And there we go. So one person in the chat here, their DevSecOps program is all the way optimizing at the top of the chain. I would love to hear some more about that, that individual and that organization. But the vast majority here are in more of the initial and managed phase. That's more what we would expect. I mean, DevOps has been around for a significant number of years now, but the focus on DevSecOps has been admittedly much more recent, and it's continuing to obviously gain momentum. Again, that's probably part of the reason why you're here. So we should have some good takeaways for you as we continue moving through. All right. So now, there we go. One thing that I do want to clarify before we move forward. Traditionally, and I'm guilty of making this same mistake, I'll say, or just maybe uh, not thinking about it in the most comprehensive way possible. DevSecOps is not just about integrating security into application development. It's thinking about the overall relationship between those 3 teams and leveraging the underlying principles in order to ensure that collaboration and holistic business value is generated. So again, something I've traditionally thought is, well, how can we just integrate security into DevOps in the most streamlined manner? Instead, now I try to take a more holistic view that says, well, how can these 3 teams, Dev, Sec, and Ops, further work together across each other, across each of the 3 business units? One good example there would be, well, how can a security team actually leverage DevOps for their own deployment and development? So if a security team's building an in-house security tool, whether it's a custom application for vulnerability management or whatever it might be, they should be leveraging some of those same principles. And that way you're just, again, thinking about this entire DevSecOps approach from a very holistic standpoint that encourages that collaboration and extended business value. Now, a couple of things to talk about, and I promise very quickly we'll get into the tactical recommendations. First of all, insecurity in DevOps and how that ties into DevSecOps, because despite what we just talked about on that last slide, DevSecOps really has stemmed from the security challenges that were originally in place with DevOps. When DevOps first spun up, and even still today, a standard DevOps program uh, creates significant challenges for a security team. They're trying to move extremely, extremely fast. And so, as we think about what security needs to do, if security continues to work in the traditional manner, then it's going to naturally become a roadblock. When developers are trying to push code to production every day or multiple times a day, security needs to be integrated in some way in order to ensure that they can function at that same speed. And this is where we again go back to acceptable level of risk, ensuring that the highest criticality issues are resolved, but there might be an opportunity for uh, an acceptable level to go through to production that's going to be addressed at a later time, just depending on business value. The next bullet point we'll talk about here, developer teams do not always see the value of security. And I'm sure we'll get to this in a second in our polling question, but I'm sure many organizations struggle with this just in this audience, where developers traditionally come at their work from a very product and feature driven standpoint. Security is more and more becoming a focus for these different teams. We can see commercials that are being shown. I love to shout out the different Apple commercials that talk about privacy and security, and how that is now being viewed as a feature, as security and privacy itself, that is. So developers are moving in the right direction, but ultimately, one of the keys to success for a DevSecOps program is ensuring that the developers and the security teams are working with each other as partners. They both understand the value of what the other is doing so that they can collaborate effectively. Then finally, we talked a little bit already about shift left. It's important to ensure that security is incorporated early in the cycle. Again, tying back to that first bullet point, we don't want security to be a roadblock for these developer teams. And so incorporating security earlier in that process helps ensure that developers have a significant period of time to address the important security vulnerabilities. And it's not just a scan that's performed right before an application is getting ready to go to production, because then again, as we think about that partnership, developers are not going to be very happy with their security partners if there's new features or new requirements added right before they were ready to deploy their application. Now, of course, it's always easier said than done. There are significant challenges that come with DevSecOps. I mean, as we think about what we've already talked through today, DevSecOps really involves people, process, and technology, and any one of those in itself should present its own challenges. But a few key ones here: impaired delivery. So we talked about what it takes to be successful with DevSecOps. Well, in the early days, the intense focus on automation or integration or whatever it might be can actually still impair the development team, even though you're trying to make that process as frictionless as possible. A good example is if you integrate a, let's say, static application security testing tool into a continuous integration, continuous delivery, CI/CD pipeline, and you're requiring no, let's say, medium vulnerabilities, high or critical vulnerabilities to be identified before that application can finish its deployment, then you might have some frustrated developers. And again, that's where we have to set guidelines. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Then we have lack of resources. DevSecOps is still largely new. It's very difficult as a security team to, let's say, recruit security professionals who have a development background and can adequately work in this space. It's a difficult space to train in because of how rapidly it's evolving. It's obviously feasible and it's obviously achievable, but it is a significant challenge for many organizations, especially those that are just getting started with this journey. And then finally, lack of standardization. We'll talk a little bit more about the idea of starting small and scaling. However, as we think about that scaling piece, it can be difficult for organizations to ensure that there's the same standard processes or technologies that are used across an organization and across a variety of different application teams. Uh, Oftentimes, each different development team might be programming in a different language. They might be using a different workflow management tool. They might be using a different CI/CD pipeline. And these are technology examples, but that lack of standardization makes it significantly more difficult for a security team to integrate and work across all these different constructs. So we will be giving tips on how to address all of those as well. But let's talk about poll question number 2. What is the most significant challenge your organization is facing? Again, we can think about this a little bit as people, process, and technology. Trying to understand, again, for those that have at least attempted DevSecOps so far, I'll assume those that are in the initial phase have maybe given some initial efforts at maybe baseline integration, baseline work within the DevSecOps domain. What have you seen as the biggest limiting factor to your success so far? And we'll give it another few seconds here, and then we'll go ahead and close it up. All right, that should be plenty of time. Let's see the results. Trained personnel. So that's one of the challenges. I actually really like this answer breakdown. I'm going to talk about it for just a second here. First of all, we can see one of the challenges we talked about on the last slide, just the resource constraints, having the right skills in place. Then we can see the collaborative culture, which we also already talked about, ensuring that developers and security are working together. And then finally, we see effective use of security tooling. And part of the reason I made that remark and just liking to see these answers is oftentimes it's very easy for organizations and individuals to focus on the technology piece. There's so many vendors today that are providing all these different tools that are labeled as DevSecOps, but at the end of the day, without the appropriate people, without the appropriate culture and underlying processes, it's very difficult to use those tools effectively. And so as we think about the most significant challenge or the biggest limiting factor, it makes sense to me that that's the minority that has tooling as the issue there. All right, let's keep moving. Reset the screen here. Perfect. So now let's get into the fun stuff. We've broken up this presentation into the first 90 days approach. It doesn't have to be a strict 90 days, but the theme is here. This is what you can do to get started with your DevSecOps program today. Here are some ideas as far as how you might break it down into tangible initiatives. And then at the end of these first few slides, we'll talk about a couple more examples as far as ongoing opportunities for improvement as well. So as we go through each one of these different recommendations, I'll provide a brief description of what that actually means and talk a little bit about the value that you're going to see from that. So first of all, as we think about the first 30 days, it's really laying the foundation for your program. And we can see here, if you peek ahead a little bit on the sidebar on that right side, phase 2 is a pilot project. And so laying the foundation, you're getting ready for that initial DevSecOps project where you're making the attempt at integrating security into an application development team and doing so effectively. So what have we already talked about so far? The importance of the partnerships between development and security. So naturally, a security champions program makes sense as far as laying that foundation. A security champions program is basically creating liaisons in the development teams that function as a point of contact and reference point for security. And so as we think about the relationships that might be strained or might just have organizational disconnect between these teams, if you have someone in the development team that's responsible or at least collaborating with security, it becomes a much easier point of contact for that development team and ensures that it's a much more innate focus on security for that same application team. And so by developing the Security Champions program, you don't need to go ahead and pick a security champion for every single one of your development teams in that first day or even in that first 30 days, but rather just forming your approach to ensure, okay, this is how we're going to address a security champion on an ongoing basis. This is how we're going to select a security champion. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the pilot project slide on the next slide here. Now, after that, we have established feedback loops. For those who might not be familiar with the tenets of DevOps, I'll just go ahead and relay those for everyone. It's flow, feedback, and continuous learning. And one of the things that I often try to reflect on as we think about DevSecOps is how you can use those same three principles of DevOps to encourage further value. And so flow is basically reducing friction as much as possible, ensuring that work flows smoothly. Feedback is putting in the appropriate telemetry sources to identify different metrics from the work that you've put in place. And then finally, continuous learning is ensuring that you're learning from that telemetry to make continuous improvement. So as we think about laying a foundation for a DevSecOps program, what kind of feedback loops can we strategize ahead of time to ensure that when we actually go ahead with this pilot project, we can learn from that experience, improve the pilot project itself, but then also improve the subsequent efforts as well. So a good example here, if you go ahead and design some sort of brief survey, or maybe you just set up an open communication channel for feedback, or even just a 15-minute meeting where people can go ahead and provide some feedback, whatever it might be, just make sure you have some sort of strategy for capturing feedback from the teams you're going to be working with. And once again, think about the impact to the developers for providing this time and this sort of effort, in the sense that uh, once again, developers have other priorities. Don't build a 100 question survey that gets to all the nitty gritty possible details that you would like, but make sure that you build some sort of feedback form that can be rapidly addressed and still gives the developers the opportunity to address their biggest concerns. And that's again a theme that we'll see throughout this entire first 90 days and onwards, is ensuring that you're thinking about the developers' priorities. So finally, last one here, fortify your testing suite. We already talked a little bit about technology and how technology isn't generally going to be the limiting factor, but at the same time, if you're building out an application security program, you're going to need some sort of application security testing technology. There's lots of open source versions that are out there today, and ultimately it's not going to be feasible or sustainable to have some sort of manual security review performed for these different application teams, and leveraging technology is going to ensure that you can do it in a more rapid and streamlined manner. So as we think about what that actually consists of with your testing suite, there's all sorts of application security testing that exists today. We think about static, dynamic, interactive, you have software composition analysis. I'd say as long as you can get at least static application security testing, and we'll talk about SCA a bit more in a second, then that's at least a good enough start to pull in critical vulnerabilities that might otherwise not be addressed. So again, you don't need all four, you don't need a comprehensive tool set, but at least make sure you have something there that can be useful. Then we get into the pilot project. And I want to harp on this one more time. I talk about this in virtually every single one of my blog posts, white papers, thought leadership, whatever it is. This whole idea of starting small and scaling is critical to ensure that you're achieving the appropriate value and doing so in a feasible manner. Rather than going out to every single team in your organization and saying, we're doing DevSecOps now, pick a single team that has a strong relationship with your security team and use them as sort of a guinea pig to see how the process will go. You can leverage those feedback channels, leverage your continuous learning process to ensure that you're learning from that experience. And then as you continue to scale out, it's going to be done in a much more effective manner that prevents catastrophic failure of your entire DevSecOps rollout. As we already talked about, just because it's change across people, process, and technology, it can be extremely difficult to get perfectly right. And so this approach allows for a much more stable rollout. Now, as we think about this pilot project, we already talked about a couple examples on the last slide. We have security champions, so you can go ahead and pick a representative on that team, work with that team to understand which one of the developers has maybe expressed an interest in security in the past, which one is hoping to improve their security knowledge, which is maybe just a general team leader that would like to take on that extra responsibility. Work with them to establish that security champions relationship, ensure that they understand how, let's say you have a SAST tool, ensure how SAST tools work. And then we'll talk about integration in a little bit as well. But the next step would be performing some threat modeling. And this is where you don't need to rely on fancy technology. You can leverage frameworks that exist out there today. The Stride framework, STRIDE, is a great framework that was put out by Adam Shostak back when he was at Microsoft. It's rather old now, but it's still a leader in the space, completely free to go ahead and reference this model. This will help you format how your teams go about your threat modeling activities. And one other thing to note on threat modeling, the earlier you perform it, the better, as with most of these different security controls. But one of the key benefits of threat modeling when it's done early is you get these developers thinking about security concerns. And often that's just half the battle. As soon as developers realize, oh, that might be a risk later on in terms of how we're planning on deploying or how we're planning on designing this database backend, whatever it might be, having that threat model in place that allows the developers to think about it will help ensure that they address some of their own risk as they go through the application development process. Now, finally, we talked about this on one of the first couple of slides, software composition analysis. Those tools, for those who aren't familiar, basically scan the third-party libraries that you're using within your applications to understand if there are known vulnerabilities that exist in those libraries. So a good example, if you're using a version of jQuery, just because jQuery has so many or so much functionality built into it, there's very often vulnerabilities in each of those different applications or each of those different library versions, rather. One of the interesting things I've played around with recently is if you go to any web page and you right click and you go to the Chrome developer tools, you can see a tab for Lighthouse. And if you run that report, you can actually get a brief overview of SCA vulnerabilities within a website. So if you're trying to do this for your own organization, that's not the most comprehensive way of doing it, but that is one way if you're just poking around on a website and you're curious, well, I wonder how good is this team at actually securing their website? And maybe it's something you want to go do and play around on your own website just so you understand what others can see within 45 seconds. Again, that's right click on a website, Chrome developer tools. You can use the inspect button and then scroll over, click on Lighthouse, generate the report. This whole process takes less than 2 minutes and you can see some vulnerabilities. Again, you'll often see jQuery issues there. And the reason I'm talking about this so much is because it's very low level of effort to remediate these SCA identified vulnerabilities, in the sense that SAST vulnerabilities, you might have to completely rework features in order to address those. With SCA, very often it's just updating your software or updating your software libraries, the packages you're leveraging to the latest version, which again, as we think about level of effort for a developer, that's about as easy as it gets. All right, so days 61 through 90, you have your pilot project up and running. Well, now it's time to continue building on that momentum. Again, maybe you're already flying through the pilot project. You don't have to wait 30 days to continue improving it. You don't have to wait 30 days to start expanding to that second one. If the first one's going extremely successful, again, each of these is going to vary slightly for your organization, but keep in mind just the general principles that we're talking about here. So as we're in phase 3, we're strengthening what we've already put in place. We'll implement a CI/CD pipeline. Realistically, your organization is probably already using a CI/CD pipeline within your application teams, and more likely the focus here is going to be integrating security into those CI/CD pipelines. And so again, we already talked about this a little bit, but making sure that as you integrate security, it's done so very carefully to ensure that you're not just overwhelming your development team with a plethora of different application vulnerabilities that your security team is saying you have to resolve all of these. There's a level of feasibility to this vulnerability management process, as everyone here is probably familiar with, and you don't want to overwhelm your developers from day one. So maybe a good place to start is just all critical and high vulnerabilities should be remediated. It depends on the acceptable level of risk for your organization. Now, the next piece here, building secure infrastructure templates. So as we think about DevSecOps and DevOps in general, obviously these teams are deploying very rapidly. Oftentimes they're deploying from something such as a container registry. Well, as a security team, and as you think about the individuals in your team that might be responsible for infrastructure security, it's important that you leverage those different integrations that are in place. So if your team's deploying from a container registry, make sure that you have the appropriate security controls in place and the appropriate security hardening on the containers in that registry. So that way, these developers don't even need to make a conscious effort to deploy securely. They just deploy securely by default because security has put in that legwork ahead of time to ensure that everything in that registry is secure. Now, all sorts of different tools that are available to help with your container security efforts. Uh, there's lots of options out there if you're looking for just somewhere to get started. I mean, there's tools such as Docker has a beta for a new container scanning platform. Aqua, Twistlock, all leaders in this space. It's worth checking out if it's something your organization has not considered in the past. Now, finally, a very DevSecOps bullet point for everyone here: dedicate time to reflect. We talked about feedback already. We're 90 days through our DevSecOps program. Hopefully, you're doing this even sooner than 90 days in, but at least at this point, if you've put it off, make sure that you're thinking about the feedback that you've received and implementing changes as a result. The point is not just to capture feedback for the sake of capturing feedback, but rather leveraging that feedback to inform some sorts of changes. Now, phase four, integrate into your business. Again, this is really going to be an ongoing effort, but continue to integrate the technology across your security and development tool sets. One good example would be workflow management. This is an example I love to talk about. If you think about a tool like Jira, which is probably in use within your organization, there's the opportunity to integrate findings from your SaaS tool into Jira so developers have tickets automatically created. Again, it's a great example where we need to be careful when going through that. You can't just have every single vulnerability automatically translated into Jira, or your developers will not be happy. Maybe start with just critical and maybe work to ensure that false positives have been largely addressed and tuned out before you focus on that integration. Now, beyond that, empowering developers, and this again goes back to the culture piece, making sure that developers start to take ownership of security issues within their platform. They should view security as one of the key features, and they should hopefully work to ensure that their product is as secure as possible. Now, that includes empowering developers to run their own SAST scans, for example, ensuring that they have access to whatever security technology makes sense so that they can continue to operate and run the DevSecOps program themselves as much as possible. Again, this might not be feasible within the first 90 days, but this can be a continued effort and cultural shift that your organization can work towards. And then finally, training developers in secure coding. I won't speak about this one for too long, but one thing that I will highlight is training is often far more valuable when it's specific to your organization. This is something Netflix actually talked about at a conference back when those were still a thing. Their security team was talking about the importance of specified training that worked on problems that they were actually facing for their applications. So specific to their language, specific to their application threat landscape. And that way, these developers are going to be far more engaged with what security actually looks like. So as you think about what makes sense for security training for your developers, make sure that's as targeted and specific as possible. Now, finally, a couple of just bonus points here. Uh, Again, beyond 90 days, there's all sorts of efforts that you can continue to make with DevSecOps. Um, I won't claim this is an exhaustive list even after this slide, but here are a couple more things to keep in mind. First of all, secrets management. I'm hearing more and more about secrets management just in the last year and a half or so. Everyone's starting to understand that as these applications continue to integrate, they require access of their own. And in order to limit the overall risk of your organization, it's important to manage the secrets that are used for the applications and the secrets that are used by the developers for all these various tools in a streamlined fashion. So once you get through some of the more fundamental pieces, take a look into secrets management, find out what might make sense for your organization based on whatever sorts of access solutions you're using today. Then we have actively tuning tools. And again, we talked about this a little bit already, but thinking about the false positives that are being identified, any issues that these teams are having, make sure that your security team is on top of it and putting in the effort to ensure that false positives are addressed and that there's the least friction possible with these development teams. And then finally, expand. So once you have your pilot project done, continue rolling out your DevSecOps program across an organization. Again, this entire timeline can be expedited. And when you start to scale out, it doesn't have to be, again, we had one, now we roll to the whole organization. Maybe you then take on board an additional 3 teams or additional 5 teams and continue growing in a feasible manner for your organization based on your resource constraints. So with that, we get to poll question number 3. Which of the following does your organization already have in place today? You can select all, and there's the all of the above option down at the bottom there as well. We'll give it just a minute here. Again, this ties back to some of the different kind of key capabilities that we just talked about on the last few slides. And if anyone is doing threat modeling for all new applications, I will be quite impressed. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll here. Integrated security testing makes sense. Threat modeling, all right, a third of people are threat modeling for all new applications. Everyone might have been underselling themselves a little bit when they labeled themselves as initial then, but that's great. Security Champions program, only a small percentage. One thing we haven't talked about a ton yet, which I should harp on a little bit, is as we think about security champions, even if you don't have an official security champions program, one thing you can do is open communication channels for your security and development teams. So if you use Slack or Teams or whatever collaboration platform you're using, make sure that developers can quickly reach out if they're having issues with security. Make sure that security is available as a resource that can help with their problems. And again, that will build that sort of partnership mentality. Then we can see secure infrastructure models. That one doesn't surprise me as much. Secrets management, some people ahead there, and then regular secure coding training. And no one has all of the above. Okay. Well, I mean, I think again, one of the key takeaways here is we talked a little bit earlier about how resources and skill sets is one of the biggest issues holding back a DevSecOps program. But then we see that only 8% have either a security champions program or regular secure coding training. And part of that, let's be honest, secure coding training can often be fairly, let's say, useless if it's not done properly. So that's something to keep in mind for your organization as you move forward. Just how can you maybe improve your security champions program or build the baseline fundamentals there or improve training to a point where it's actually valuable for the individuals in your organization that then improves their skill sets as well. That's probably a good time to also shout out our upcoming workforce development course for DevSecOps training. That'll likely be a couple of months out, but if that's something you're interested in, then go ahead and reach out and we can get you on sort of a early access list, basically walking through all the key skill sets and activities that an individual would need to know to go ahead and address a DevSecOps program properly. Okay, so I do want to make sure that I leave time for questions, but just go through these last couple of slides fairly quickly here. Do's and don'ts, key takeaways from the organization. Get security involved early, shift left. It's not just about including security, it's about including security while reducing friction to your organization. Now, the next piece, get your testing suite in order. It doesn't need to be a comprehensive testing suite, and you should not be forcing development into security controls that are unrealistic, right? We talked about realistically, it's okay if a couple of medium vulnerabilities make it into production, depends on acceptable level of risk to your organization. Understand business objectives. And this goes back to just understanding the partnership and the collaboration, that culture between development and security. Make sure that your organization is thinking about it with holistic business value in mind. Then we have invest in integration. Make sure that you put the fundamentals in place, but then once those fundamentals are in place, how can you further reduce friction by leveraging all the automation and technology options that are in place today? And on the other side, number four, one more time, start small and scale. You don't need to start your DevSecOps program across an entire organization. You can start with one team and build it out from there. And then finally, get feedback for improvement, leverage that feedback for the improvement itself. It's not just about collecting feedback, it's about using that feedback. And even if we have secure coding training, even if developers are starting to take ownership for their security of their products, you can't expect them to be security experts. They have a whole other set of job responsibilities. So make sure that security is available as a helpful resource to them. Now, last slide here, how can Focal Point help? Well, we do work across virtually everything within the DevSecOps world, but a few key examples here that might be helpful for your organization. DevSecOps assessment, so that's taking a holistic look at where your DevSecOps program is today, understanding the current state compared to industry best practices and some of the leaders in the space, some of the unicorns that we already talked about. What are the opportunities there for your team? How can we strategize those into tactical initiatives that your team can work towards that's tailored for your organization? Put that into a roadmap, and ultimately our team can help with the subsequent initiatives themselves as well, thanks to that background in the technical and strategy pieces of DevSecOps. Then we have security integration. The first piece of security integration is just connecting APIs, but as we already talked about, it's often not that simple, and that's not setting up your team for success with any sort of integration between security tools. So that's something we can help with, of course, taking a look at what makes sense for your organization. What are the key pain points for your development teams? How can we integrate tools in an effective manner that makes sense and doesn't overwhelm the various teams within the organization? And then finally, CI/CD pipeline build out. We've seen already that a lot of teams already have some sort of integration in place there. We can help either build a CI/CD pipeline from the ground up. We can build a standard CI/CD pipeline for your entire organization if you are struggling with that standardization piece. And we can also integrate the appropriate security tools. Uh, we can do just about it all. If there's anything in particular that you're struggling with, feel free to reach out to us, whether it's golden image creation for your containers, whether it's finding an appropriate security testing tool. We can help with all of this. With that, let me turn it over for questions. Again, if you have additional questions that you don't get the chance to ask here, you can go ahead and email me, kmcnulty@focalpoint.com. There's lots of great information available on our website. We're posting new blogs and white papers in this space all the time. I feel like I never stop writing these days. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the questions here. Gene said, surprised that defined is not number 2 and managed is number 3. That's fair. That was the scale I found online. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, ultimately, the 1 through 5 scale gets at the same piece. Russell asked, is the goal to have security while developing or to have security once in production? That's a great question. So I would say the goal is to have security once in production. However, there's an important piece of security while developing, and often security while developing translates into security in production. One great example we can talk about is SolarWinds. For those who followed that entire incident, part of the issue was the lack of security in their development environment, which was then able to be escalated to their production environment. So the development environment actually posed that initial risk to the organization. So if we talk about what's the importance of having security while developing, well, ultimately that can lead to insecurity in production if it's not done properly. And the other piece we talked about, friction and the whole idea of shifting left. Well, again, shifting left can help improve the security in production because security is no longer a bottleneck for these development teams before that application actually goes to production. So by incorporating security earlier, you can ensure that those security concerns are actually addressed in the proper time frame. Next, we have question from Gene, I guess a DevSecOps team can only be effective or optimized if it's mostly automated. What are the biggest challenges to automation, code review, or what areas? So I would say, as we think about that 5-step scale, then I would agree with that conclusion. It can probably only be optimized if automation is in place for most of it. I would say a DevSecOps team can still be effective, at least in some regard, even without full automation. So a good example is if you compare what traditional security might look like to what DevSecOps and modern application security looks like, that can still be far more effective without that optimized version. So even if you're just getting started with DevSecOps, maybe you've implemented threat modeling for all of your applications, for example, then that's still going to be beneficial and effective in itself. It might not be comprehensive, but it's a start. Let me answer the second part of that question. What are the biggest challenges to automation? Again, we talked about this a little bit, but what I would say is automating effectively. One of the key issues that I often see at different organizations, and this isn't even necessarily specific to DevSecOps. I mentioned that I have a bit of a background in security operations as well. We see this with SOAR platforms all the time. So security orchestration, automation, and response. These tools that allow you to integrate like a SIM tool, security incident event management tool, with other tools in the organization. And when organizations get carried away with their SOAR platform and automating everything under the sun, all of a sudden that tool becomes far less effective because of how much just clutter and bad information is brought in. And so I'd say the biggest issue or the biggest challenge to automation is thinking through the automation appropriately ahead of time, ensuring that when the automation is done, it's not just about connecting two platforms, but rather it's about ensuring that those two platforms are connected in an effective manner. And then beyond that, how are you actually managing that automation over time? It's not just about building an automation and moving on. It's ensuring that there's an appropriate relationship between the team that's building the automation and the end users of those tools. So as feedback comes through, that automation is improved and continued to be developed. Because again, if we think about like built-in connections that might exist for something like Veracode and Jira, let's say, then the key aspects of that integration are likely going to change over time as they release different features on both of those platforms. And so it's important there's some sort of ongoing maintenance. Now, finally, do you help internal audits with their audits of DevSecOps? The answer is yes. That DevSecOps assessment that I mentioned is often actually performed on behalf of internal audit or IT audit. This is something we see across really our entire security landscape. We have all sorts of security and audit professionals within Focal Point. And again, oftentimes the people who are engaging us are on behalf of audit, either as an informal assessment to prepare for an audit or as an official audit. We do work across PCI, HIPAA, all that fun stuff. So if that's something you're interested in further, then feel free to reach out. Again, kmcnulty at focal-point.com. We have 5 minutes left on the call here. Any other last questions anyone wants to throw in? Give just a minute. If not, one of the questions I'll throw out, where are some other resources that you can learn more? And I'll give some quick Focal Point shout outs, but then there's also other great resources available online. First of all, again, like I mentioned, our website has information on blogs fairly frequently. We have a short video series. I'm putting us on the record now. Our marketing team is going to help us develop a short video series that walks through some of the key elements of DevSecOps, cloud security, all that fun stuff. We have thought leaders across the security world that are posting on our website. You can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn. That's where we post a lot of our content as well. As far as other third-party resources, I already mentioned that Stride framework that's available. You can just Google STRIDE if you're looking for some help with your threat modeling or additional organization with your threat modeling. If you haven't heard of the State of DevOps report that's put out by Puppet, one of the things we already talked about is how security has to understand the goals and the business objectives of the development team. And so even if you're a security professional, go ahead and take a look at the State of DevOps report and understand what DevOps is really looking like today and how security can help enable some of those different objectives. Security has often been incorporated into those state of DevOps reports as of the last couple of years, just because DevSecOps and DevOps are often becoming kind of conflated as one idea at this point, and as it kind of should be if we think about it as a security practitioner. And then finally, lots of organizations publish state of DevSecOps reports as well, just because, again, there's so many vendors in this DevSecOps space. Uh, there's all sorts of information, statistics you can find as far as how this space is changing, what different organizations are struggling with. So with that, thank you everyone for your time. Again, 48 hours for your CPEs. Recording will be released within the next 24 to 48 hours here. If you have questions, you can contact me directly. You can email info@focal-point.com. Whatever it is, I'm happy to set up a chat and just talk about whatever challenges you're dealing with within your organization. Want to be a resource for everyone here and make sure that even if it's not turning into a project for us, we can provide tailored information to your organization and just be generally helpful. So with that, we can go ahead and wrap up this webinar, and thank you everyone again. Hopefully this was a valuable use of your time this afternoon.